A prophet is someone who tells something forth rather than literally predicting something before it happens. Jesus in today's gospel tells his disciples what is going to happen in Jerusalem in the next few days. He's only telling them what they should already see for themselves. Nothing mysterious or supernatural about it. Jesus tells them that he's going to Jerusalem. Jerusalem spells big trouble. Why? Because Jesus is a big-time troubler of everything that Jerusalem stands for in Jesus' time. The Son of Man, says Jesus of himself, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected of the elders and of the chief priests and scribes and be killed, or as it's better translated, accomplish his exodus. That's how it's put in the Transfiguration. And after 3 days, rise again. Jesus has been increasingly attacking the temple, its priests, and the political economy that it supports, and often off which it fattens itself outrageously. It's all part of the oppressive apparatus of government and economy, all bound together by a religion gone badly astray and totally manipulated by the brutal arch-politician Herod the Great, the king of the Jews, who died when Jesus was just a toddler. Jesus is only just congratulated before this exchange. He's just congratulated Peter for his insight into the fact that Jesus is the true Messiah. Now, Peter freaks out at the prospect of Jerusalem lying just ahead. And Jesus rounds on him. "Get behind me, you Satan, you." It's become more and more clear that Jesus and his disciples, when push comes to shove, they live in different worlds. And it's the world of Jesus that's the real world. The world where injustice and evil triumph and good people are put down and put out, and where anyone who tries to do something about it gets snuffed out by Homeland Security and the empire beyond. Jesus was only one of many messiahs who tried to remedy things in those days. Many of these other messiahs were religious terrorists, unlike Jesus, violent messiah saviours. Almost all of them ended up crucified or murdered. The temple archbishops and ayatollahs eventually concluded that Jesus' style of loving messiahship was even more dangerous than the violent type, especially when Jesus publicly condemned the leadership and started a riot around the money changers and seemed to be setting up a sort of very popular, half-mocking counter-kingdom of his own. His carefully staged triumphal entry into Jerusalem was a kind of mockery of an Augustus Caesar or King Herod the Great entering a city with their motorcades and their sirens blazing. So Jesus tells it like it is and like it is about to be, all in one breath, and Peter doesn't like it one bit. Jesus foretells his own death, and he foretells also in his own death the death of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, which also happened 40 years later. And that didn't require supernatural foresight either. Jesus, like any decent prophet, had unerring antennae for the signs of the times. He could interpret the historical, political, economic, and sacral events and activities that were going on around him. And he did it in religious as well as material and, you might say, political scientific terms. But he did it in sacral terms too, sub specie aeternitatis, even in the mirror of eternity. St. Matthew's preachers have for several years now been happily stripping away the old supernaturalist wallpaper, trying to get back to the basics that supernatural lingo was trying to bear witness to. So my rendering here this morning, my rather secular rendering of Jesus the prophet, will come as no surprise to the St. Matthew's congregation. Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist, munching his locust and honey muesli in the desert, said that he himself was no Messiah. He was no more than a voice crying in the wilderness. For poor old Elijah, whom John the Baptist was very aware of in his own ministry, for Elijah, that little voice in the desert mountain was not in an earthquake or a firestorm, but in a still small voice, telling the understandably reluctant prophet to go back and converse politely or impolitely with his significant other, the formidable Queen Jezebel, who was being cheated of her conjugal rights and who was thirsting for the prophet's blood. And just after this little bruising conversation with Peter, Jesus took his own quaking disciples up his own prophetic desert mountain as well, Transfiguration Mountain, to get away from it all, so they thought, mistakenly, as usual. It's transfiguration time then on the mountain, though. The long-dead Elijah and the long-dead Moses, champion survivors of the desert situation, they appear to talk things over with the soon-to-be-dead Jesus. This is no mere table-rapping seance, though. There's only one item on their agenda, the so-called Exodus, that Jesus is about to accomplish in Jerusalem. All three of these prophetic giants had multiple exoduses and liberations and freedom fightings in their bones, spiritually as well as politically. The three disciples, the quaking ones, gradually got their spirits back up. But when Jesus said, "Time to go," they wanted to stay. "No way," said Jesus. Now let me come now to the second part of this sermon. From the sublime, you might say, to the ridiculous. The year is 1975. 1975. Well, it's 1975 years past the time of Jesus anyway. And it's now Auckland. 50 years ago, actually. Yeah, I think I've got my arithmetic right. Here's another trio, far from a holy one this time, assembles. Ted Buckle has just arrived from Australia to be vicar of St. Matthew's. John Mullane, later also an illustrious vicar of this illustrious parish. John and I were dinkum Kiwis, having been students together at St. John's earlier. I had just come, myself, from 4 quick-fire parish assignments in Dunedin and Christchurch to become a lecturer in systematic theology at St. John's College. We 3 young patriarchs were expected to turn the church upside down and inside out. We were respected after a fashion, though not always exactly popular. I learned a huge amount from having to fit in with Ted and John. Only on one thing did we fully agree, but that one thing was a revelation to me. After a transfigurative day together at the Clevedon Vicarage, we concluded that it was not actually our job as clergy, it was not our job ourselves to do the prophetic work of the church for it, but to help the whole church to do its own prophetic work itself as a community. Now, there's a big difference in what I just said, and it's not as easy as it sounds. For myself, I went on to actually extend this single idea that so blew my mind on that day and has done so ever since. I concluded, after much theological wrestling, what everybody probably knows because it's only common sense, I concluded that our job as total church was not actually to be prophet and priest to the world. Our job was to help the whole of humanity be prophet and priest for the world and for the church. Now, what I've just said is a kind of monstrous shorthand, and I'll have to turn to the experience briefly of the 1960s, which includes the 1970s and half of the 1980s as well. So it's a bit of a misnomer, but never mind. So I have to turn to the poets and artists, sacred or profane, to explain a bit more. In the 1960s, which many of you are familiar from your own experience anyway, we're no spring chickens. So in the 1960s, reality and divine reality seemed to have deserted an unreal and failing church, and to be reappearing in very different garb in totally worldly situations. From the Beatles on, out of anyone's control, the words of the prophets turned out written not in sermons in churches, but on subway walls. Curiously, the churches at that time, anyway, to their great credit, started to realise that our Jesus was deserting our sanctuaries the same way as people were departing from the pews. For the Catholic Church's Vatican II Council, for example, strove mightily to lay out what might be the mode of a new church in the modern world, perhaps the greatest document produced in that amazing council. The Anglican missionary leader, on the side of the heretics over in the United Kingdom, the Anglican missionary leader Max Warren told the World Anglican Congress of that time in Toronto in Canada that you needed to have the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. Teilhard de Chardin declared that when the two realities, God and the world, met together, everything burst into flame. Bonhoeffer said, we had to stop expecting Christ to come to us as a powerful rescuer. Christ, said Bonhoeffer, was in the world, struggling as well as the others struggling to preserve that world. And Christians had to get in there with him. Bonhoeffer knew what he was talking about. He was jailed by Hitler and executed by Hitler's express order in the last days of the 1939-45 war. And our own Lloyd Geering, to whom I'd quite like to dedicate this sermon this morning, it was his birthday during this last week, our own Lloyd Geering said it was time to strip away the supernatural and be honest about what we didn't believe. The church expelled him, the secular world loved and honoured him. And now for me, 10 years after Ted and John, in 1974, another magical trio appeared. It sort of seems to go in threes. No, it doesn't always work mathematically like that, but works all right for the sermon. But another magical trio appeared, and myself this time on the periphery, a fourth one, looking on in a way. At St John's College, another young trio of students emerged, a wondrous group actually of young patriarchs in the making, allowed no longer, though, by their womenfolk to remain patriarchs. They endured the college educational regime for 6 months, then declared direct action in shaping their own education, curriculum, pedagogy, assessment, credentialing, the lot. They were not rebels. They just set out on the road less travelled. That's the way they saw it. At the moment of their decision, I felt almost a transfiguring light around the three of them. I kid you not. With my shiny new Princeton PhD, St John's College put me in charge of this trio. Ha ha. I'm writing my book about around the 1960s, 1965 to 1985 to be more precise. I think that period still has to fulfil itself. It was a prophetic 20 years for New Zealand, like a good prophet actually, stating the obvious. There were hot button issues everywhere, and I had strangely enough, God knows how it happened, I had my fumbling finger on several of these buttons, and more than my finger, I tell you, got burnt. There was the Vietnam War when we took placards into the Holy Good Friday procession. Placards saying Christ died for the Viet Cong, Christ died for Anzacs, and the poor old bishop, pressed hard by his scandalised burghers up the front of the procession, had to ask the police to remove us. And then there was, we created a thin Santa Claus the following Christmas, and we joined in with Tim Shadbolt's 10,000 strong Liberation Army of Albert Park. Then there was theological and other education, as I've just referred to with the other trio of students. And then, of course, there's the great success story, the nuclear warships in New Zealand. That one really stuck. Still seems to be there, despite the present Prime Minister and his antics. And then, of course, there was the outbreak again, the new outbreak of the Civil War that had come with the settler wars earlier. I refer to the Springbok tour. And rugby was just the right thing to have a good civil war over. And we still seem to be suffering from the soreness of that. I can't quite understand it, but still. But still today, underneath all the neoliberal lingo and posturing, still today we're struggling with the same underlying issues as were brought out crystal clear through the 60s. They're still with us, thank God. John Mullane and Ted Buckle are dead now, but they are with me every Sunday here. And I've been discussing this sermon with them in this past week. The congregation can join in this discussion later this morning after a cup of tea. There's so much more, but for now, Amen.